At dawn on January 14, 1944, Corporal Mason Ridley lay motionless in a pine bough 18 feet above the frozen floor of the Naliboki Forest. The temperature was minus 35 degrees Celsius. Ridley had been wedged in this position for 11 hours, his body wrapped in frozen rags, clutching a modified Springfield M1903 he had built from salvaged junk. He was 40 miles behind enemy lines. In the last 3 weeks alone, he had silently eliminated 83 Wehrmacht soldiers. Below him, a patrol of 15 Germans trudged through the snow, scanning the ground for the phantom who was hunting them. They were looking for tracks. They never thought to look up. None of them would survive the next 7 minutes. None would ever see who was shooting. How did an illiterate poacher from Kentucky survive impossible odds to become the deadliest secret of the Eastern Front? The history books won't tell you, but the 832 bodies he left behind tell a terrifying story. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. Mason Ridley was born into a world where silence was a currency and ammunition was more valuable than gold. In the deep hollers of Harlan County during the Great Depression, marksmanship wasn't a sport, it was simple arithmetic. A bullet cost 5 cents. A missed shot meant a net loss of calories and a night of listening to 6 younger siblings cry themselves to sleep with empty bellies. He didn't have a standard-issue rifle. He carried a rusted single-shot .22 that he had salvaged from a creek bed, the stock held together with baling wire and determination. When store-bought rounds became a luxury the Ridley family couldn't afford, Mason improvised. He scavenged lead from old plumbing pipes to cast his own slugs and carefully repacked spent casings with crushed match heads. The resulting ammunition was volatile and dirty, often misfiring or jamming, but it taught him the most critical lesson of his life. Make the first shot count, because you likely won't get a second. The pressure arrived early. When the roof of the Black Mountain mine collapsed in 1932, it buried Mason's father under 3 tons of slate. At 14, Mason became the patriarch of a starving household. He couldn't work the mines, so he worked the woods. Poverty created a predator. To conserve energy, Mason stopped stalking game and started becoming the landscape. He learned to sit in freezing mud for 10 hours at a time, slowing his heart rate until he felt like part of the root system. He learned to read the wind by the way a spider web trembled, and to judge distance by the clarity of a buck's antlers. The local game warden, a hard man named Deputy Hatcher, knew someone was poaching the ridgelines out of season. He found gut piles and blood trails, but he never found a boot print. Mason had learned to walk on the sides of his feet to minimize ground disturbance and to wrap his boots in burlap to muffle the crunch of dry leaves. He wasn't just hunting, he was evading capture every single day. By the time he was 18, Mason Ridley could hit a squirrel's eye at 50 yards in fading light with a warped barrel, unaware that he was training for a war that would demand the exact price he had been paying all his life. But the mountains couldn't hide him forever. When the draft notice finally came, the Army didn't see a prodigy who could vanish in plain sight. They saw an illiterate hillbilly with a defiance problem. His introduction to military life wouldn't be a medal, but a court-martial that nearly ended his war before it began. Fort Benning was a factory designed to crush individuality, and Mason Ridley was a cog that refused to fit. To the Army, he was a liability, illiterate, unkempt, and incapable of following the rigid cadence of modern warfare. While other recruits polished their boots to a mirror shine, Mason moved with a slouched, silent gait that infuriated the drill instructors. They called him hillbilly trash and swamp rat, mocking the way he inspected the wind before spitting tobacco. The tension broke in the mess hall 3 weeks into training. A fresh-faced lieutenant, eager to assert dominance, knocked Mason's tray over and made a crack about his mother having hooves. Mason didn't yell, he didn't posture, he simply delivered a single open-palmed strike to the officer's throat that dropped the man gasping to the floor. The court-martial was swift. Mason was thrown into the stockade, facing 5 years of hard labor. He sat in the darkness of solitary confinement, accepting his fate, until the heavy iron door creaked open. It wasn't a guard. It was a man in a civilian suit with eyes like flint. He didn't ask about the fight. He only asked if Mason wanted to rot in a cage or do what he was born to do. Mason was transferred to a nameless facility in Maryland, part of a new, shadowy organization called the OSS. There, they didn't hand him the standard-issue M1 Garand, the semi-automatic marvel everyone else coveted. They handed him a Springfield M1903. It was heavy, obsolete by modern standards, and beautiful. As Mason ran his scarred thumbs over the walnut stock and worked the bolt, he felt a ghost of a memory. It wasn't a modern weapon to him. It was a spiritual successor to the Kentucky long rifle his grandfather had taught him on. It didn't spray lead, it delivered judgment. It required the shooter to be deliberate, to manually cycle every round, to make a contract with the weapon for every single pull of the trigger. The OSS instructors watched in stunned silence as the illiterate prisoner stripped the rifle blindfolded and reassembled it by feel, treating the cold steel not as a tool, but as a missing limb finally returned. He had found his weapon, and the OSS had found their ghost. But the target practice was over. Mason was about to be dropped into a landscape so hostile that even the wolves froze to death, armed with a map of a country he couldn't pronounce and orders that officially didn't exist. The static line snapped, and Mason Ridley fell into a void so cold it felt like being punched in the lungs. The darkness of the Belarusian night swallowed him whole, the roar of the C-47 engines fading into the whistling wind. Below him lay the Naliboki forest, a sprawling ocean of black pines and frozen swamps that had become the graveyard of the Eastern Front. He hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively to absorb the impact, tangled in the chute. The air smelled different here, not like the clean pine of Kentucky, but sharp with the scent of cordite, wet ash, and unburied bodies. The partisan unit he was sent to advise emerged from the shadows like specters. They were a ragged collection of escaped POWs and local farmers, their eyes hollowed out by starvation and atrocities. They looked at the clean-shaven American with a mixture of hope and deep suspicion. He was supposed to teach them sabotage and small unit tactics, but the language barrier was a thick wall. To them, he was just another foreigner in a war that had already consumed millions. The distrust evaporated 2 days later, replaced by a terrified awe. A German sweeping patrol had pinned the partisan group down in a ravine. The firefight was chaotic, a messy exchange of submachine gun fire that chewed up the trees but hit nothing. The partisans shouted and sprayed bullets blindly, wasting precious ammunition. Mason didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply ghosted away from the main group, climbing a ridge that offered a narrow, obscured sightline. He settled the Springfield into the crook of a birch branch. Down below, an officer was barking orders, confident in his cover behind a destroyed tractor. He adjusted for the bitter crosswind, exhaled, and squeezed. The officer's helmet spun in the air. Before the body hit the snow, Mason cycled the bolt. 2 seconds later, the machine gunner slumped over his weapon. A third shot took out the radio operator. Silence fell over the ravine. The Germans retreated, unsure of what had just hit them. The partisans stared at Mason, who was calmly collecting his brass casings from the snow. In that moment, the mission changed. Mason realized he couldn't teach these desperate men how to be soldiers, but he could do something far more valuable. He could clear the path for them. He packed his gear, ignoring the stunned looks of the men he was supposed to lead. He wasn't a teacher, he was a hunter, and the forest was full of game. But the Germans weren't just going to let their men die without a fight. They were about to wake up to a new kind of warfare, and their response would bring a monster out of the shadows. By November, the mud of autumn had hardened into iron-gray frost, and Mason Ridley disappeared. He didn't dig trenches, and he didn't seek the warmth of partisan bunkers. Instead, he returned to the canopy. In Harlan County, hunting white-tailed deer had taught him that prey rarely looks up. The Wehrmacht soldiers were no different. They were trained to scan the horizon for tanks and the ground for tripwires, but their peripheral vision ended at eye level. Mason exploited this blind spot with ruthless efficiency. He lashed pine boughs together 20 feet off the ground, creating invisible platforms high in the trees, a tactic unknown in European warfare, but common in the Kentucky hardwoods. He found his rhythm against an elite SS reconnaissance unit tasked with rooting out partisan cells. 12 men, heavily armed and arrogant, moved through the sector with mechanical precision. They marched in rigid formations, checked the same checkpoints at the same times, and followed the path of least resistance. To Mason, they weren't soldiers. They were cattle moving through a chute. The dismantling began on a Tuesday. Mason didn't shoot the officer first. He shot the radio operator at the rear of the column, the crack of the Springfield swallowed by the heavy wind. The man dropped silently into a snowbank. The unit marched on for another mile before noticing they were one man short. When they doubled back, they found the body, but no shooter. Mason began to play with them. He laid false trails, clumsy, obvious boot prints leading into frozen marshes. The SS soldiers, desperate for a target, took the bait. As they waded thigh-deep into the freezing slush, weapons raised toward the reeds, Mason watched from a tree stand 70 yards behind them. He took 2 more that afternoon. The shots seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. By the 3rd day, the discipline of the master race had crumbled into paranoia. The remaining soldiers refused to sprint out. They huddled together, terrified of the silent forest. Mason waited. He stayed in his perch for 16 hours, urinating into a canteen to avoid leaving scent or sign. When a corporal finally cracked and bolted for the tree line, Mason ended him mid-stride. By the 5th day, only the unit commander remained. He was found wandering in circles, firing his Luger blindly into the treetops, screaming at a phantom he couldn't see. Mason didn't grant him a quick death. He let the cold take the officer first, watching through his scope as the man froze in a fetal curl. Mason descended from the tree, collected his brass, and vanished again. The forest was silent, but the silence carried a weight. The Germans found the bodies arranged in the snow, but what terrified High Command wasn't the death toll, it was the ballistics report. The trajectory angles were impossible. The shots had come from the sky, and they were about to give this phantom a name. Winter in the east had always been deadly, but in the sector held by the 12th Infantry Division, the cold was no longer the soldiers' primary fear. It was the silence between the gusts of wind. Reports began piling up on the mahogany desks of the Abwehr intelligence officers in Minsk. They were confusing, panicked scrawls from the front lines that defied military logic. A logistics officer shot through the throat while inspecting a tire, surrounded by 20 men who saw no muzzle flash. A convoy of 3 Opel Blitz trucks found idling in a clearing, engines running, heat blasting, all 3 drivers dead behind the wheel with identical wounds to the left temple. The windshields were intact. The shots had come through the open side windows from angles that suggested the shooter was floating in the air.
Fear is a virus, and it spread faster than typhus in the crowded bunkers. The Wehrmacht soldiers stopped wearing their rank insignias. Officers stopped saluting in the open. They didn't walk. They scurried from cover to cover, hunched over like old men. In the mess tents, the whispers grew loud enough to be heard by the political officers. They didn't speak of a sniper. That implied a man with limits. They spoke of der Geist, the ghost, a spirit of the frozen forest that punished them for every step they took into the deep woods. The morale of the 12th Division wasn't just cracking, it was pulverizing. Patrols refused to enter the tree line. Deserters claimed they were being watched by pines that had eyes. The machinery of the German occupation was grinding to a halt because the men were too terrified to oil the gears. German high command could not court-martial a ghost, but they could kill a man. They realized that this was the work of a single anomaly, and to catch a predator, they needed a bigger one. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner sat in a warm, requisitioned chateau miles from the front, sipping real coffee while studying the casualty maps. He didn't look at the names of the dead, he looked at the geometry. He traced the lines of sight, the impossible distances, and the devastating patience required to wait for 3 trucks to align perfectly before firing. He wasn't disgusted by the butchery, he was fascinated. He recognized the pattern because it was the same one he used. Brenner closed the file, extinguished his cigarette, and smiled for the first time in months. He finally had a worthy opponent. He picked up his own rifle case, a custom leather carrier that held a weapon as precise as a surgical instrument. The ghost thought he was the hunter, but he had never been hunted by an Olympian. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner did not view the war as a struggle for ideology. He viewed it as a corruption of his art. In the summer of 1936, amidst the pageantry of the Berlin Olympics, Brenner had placed 3 rounds into a target at 300 meters with a spread smaller than a Reichsmark. He was a man of science, ballistics, and terrifying self-discipline. He didn't sweat, he didn't panic. He simply calculated windage and elevation, reducing human life to a math equation that always equaled 0. Arriving at the 12th Division's forward operating base, Brenner ignored the terrified reports of spirits and demons. He went straight to the morgue. He examined the wounds of the latest victims, using a caliper to measure entry angles. While the other officers saw brutality, Brenner saw brilliance. "He shoots from above," Brenner murmured, tracing the trajectory on a map. "Not hills, trees. He is an arboreal predator." The game began 2 days later. Brenner didn't hunt the ghost, he invited him. He set up an intricate stage in a clearing, a uniformed dummy with a realistic papier-mâché head, positioned behind a machine gun, partially obscured by netting. It was a trap designed to tempt a professional. From his hide in a hollow log 400 meters away, Brenner waited. He didn't watch the dummy, he watched the tree line. At 900 hours, the dummy's head shattered. Most snipers would have fired back immediately at the muzzle flash, but Brenner was patient. He saw the snow drift down from a high spruce branch. He adjusted his scope, accounted for the crosswind, and fired a single round into the foliage. He heard a cry, not a death scream, but a grunt of surprise. A shape tumbled from the tree, crashing through the branches, but was gone before Brenner could chamber a second round. When he investigated the site later, he found blood on the pine needles and a crude bandage wrapper made from American wool. The American was human after all, and he bled.
Ridley now knew he wasn't fighting conscripts anymore. The easy kills were over. Every shadow now held a rifle barrel. Every glint of light was a potential death sentence. The 2 men began a macabre dance across the sector, leaving false trails and booby-trapped hides for one another. They were closing the distance, circle by circle. But winter was about to turn the forest into a graveyard that neither man could escape, and the temperature was dropping to a point where the metal of a rifle could strip the skin right off a man's hand. The temperature bottomed out at 45 degrees below 0. The Nalibaki forest ceased to be a battlefield and became a cryogenic chamber. Metal stuck to bare flesh instantly, tearing skin away in bloody strips. For Mason Ridley, the cold was a more immediate executioner than Brenner or the SS. His left hand, the hand that cradled the forestock of the Springfield, had begun to die weeks ago. The circulation in his ring, middle, and pinky fingers surrendered to the frost. The tips turned white, then waxy yellow, and finally a necrotic black. There was no medic to save them. In a dugout lined with frozen moss, Mason did what was necessary. He used his hunting knife, sterilized in a flame, to sever the dead weight. He didn't scream. He bit down on a piece of leather belt until his jaw muscles spasmed. Now, wrapped in dirty bandages, his left hand was a club. He couldn't grip the rifle anymore. He had to rest the heavy walnut stock on his forearm, adjusting his entire shooting stance to compensate for the missing leverage. The pain should have stopped him. Instead, it sharpened him. The constant agony became a white noise that drowned out fear. Mason became a creature of pure instinct. He killed not for strategy, but because the heat of the rifle barrel was the only warmth he knew. His tally rose with terrifying speed. Officers, couriers, sentries, he left them where they fell, frozen statues in the snow. Then came the boy. It was late February, near a frozen creek. A German conscript stumbled through the drifts, separated from his unit. Through the scope, Mason saw the soldier clearly. He wasn't a man. He was a child, perhaps 16, his uniform hanging off a frame that hadn't finished growing. The boy was crying, tears freezing on cheeks covered in peach fuzz, fumbling with a rifle that was too heavy for him. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. The math of war said this was an enemy combatant. The soul of the man from Kentucky screamed no. Mason fired. The boy dropped instantly, the crying silenced. Mason lowered the rifle, vomit rising in his throat. He had killed 700 men, but this one face burned itself into his retinas. He saw his own younger brother in that snow. He carved a notch in the stock, but his hand shook violently, and it wasn't from the cold. He was losing himself. And miles away, Klaus Brenner had found the blood trail of a wounded animal, and he knew exactly where to set the final trap. April brought the thaw, turning the frozen hellscape into a sea of black mud. It also brought a defector, a frantic partisan claiming to know the exact location of the German command post. It was the only bait Mason Ridley couldn't refuse. He needed to end this. He tracked the defector to a ruined sawmill on the edge of the sector. He moved with his usual silence, but as he stepped into the main cutting room, the sawdust didn't smell like wood. It smelled of gun oil. The floodlights snapped on, blinding him. Mason froze. He didn't raise the Springfield. He knew the math. 20 Mauser rifles clicked in unison from the shadows. The trap had snapped shut. He wasn't taken to a dungeon. He was brought to a warm farmhouse office where Hauptmann Klaus Brenner sat waiting. The German officer didn't look at Mason with hatred. He looked at him with the reverence of a curator examining a masterpiece. Mason's battered Springfield lay on the desk between them.
832, Brenner said softly, running a gloved finger over the notches carved into the walnut stock. I counted them. You are an artist, Corporal. I'm a farmer, Mason rasped, his voice ruined from months of silence. We are both butchers, Brenner corrected, pouring 2 glasses of schnapps. He pushed one toward Mason's mangled hand. The uniform is just the apron we wear. The world calls us monsters, but they sleep safely because we do the math they are afraid to do. They spoke until dawn, not of ideology or the fatherland, but of windage, bullet drop, and the terrifying loneliness of the scope.
It was a surreal confession between two men who understood that they were already dead. At 05:45, the guards came. They marched Mason to the courtyard, pushing him against a brick wall scarred by previous executions. He declined the blindfold. He wanted to look Brenner in the eye one last time. The German Hauptmann stood off to the side, nodding a respectful farewell. "Ready!" the squad leader shouted. The bolts clattered. "Aim!" Mason took a breath, tasting the morning air. The order to fire never came. The eastern horizon suddenly dissolved into a wall of liquid fire. The ground buckled, throwing the firing squad to their knees. A screeching roar tore the sky apart as a Katyusha rocket slammed into the courtyard wall, turning the bricks and the soldiers into red mist. The Soviet offensive had begun. Mason lay in the rubble, ears ringing, covered in dust and blood that wasn't his. He was alive, but as he scrambled for his rifle in the chaos, he saw a shadow moving through the smoke, heading for the tree line. Brenner had survived too. The war had ended for everyone else, but for the two hunters, the final round was just beginning. The duel ended not with a bang, but with a whisper of lead through smoke. In the charred ruins of the village, 300 meters of burning timber separated the two hunters. Mason was bleeding heavily, a jagged piece of shrapnel lodged in his ribs, his vision graying at the edges. Brenner was waiting behind a stone chimney, methodical to the end, confident that geometry favored him. But Brenner was shooting at a target. Mason was shooting at a heartbeat. Mason saw a flicker of movement through two shattered window frames and the cab of a burning truck, a gap no wider than a coin. He didn't calculate, he didn't think, he simply let the rifle become his eye. He squeezed the trigger of the Springfield one last time. The bullet threaded the impossible needle, traversing the obstacles, to strike Brenner just as he exhaled. The German officer slumped forward, his rifle clattering against the stones. The math was finally over. Mason walked out of the forest a month later, a skeleton weighing 118 pounds, stumbling into a Soviet patrol who initially mistook him for a corpse. The journey back to the American lines was a haze of morphine and interrogations, followed by a silent train ride back to a country that was dancing in the streets for victory. When he stepped onto the porch of his farm in Harlan County, his wife Sarah dropped a basket of laundry. She didn't run to him. She stood frozen, looking at the hollowed-out stranger with the dead eyes. He had returned, but Mason Ridley had been left in the snow in Belarus.
He refused the medals mailed to the house. He threw the silver star into the creek. For 40 years, he woke up before dawn, farmed the rocky soil in silence, and never spoke a word about the war. To the town, he was just a quiet man who got lucky. They didn't know about the ritual. Every night, before blowing out the lamp, Mason opened a small leather-bound journal. He would run his missing fingers over the pages, whispering the names he had collected. 832 souls. He asked each one for forgiveness, knowing he would never receive it. When Mason died in 1986, his wife finally opened the locked box under his bed. She expected to find money or letters. Instead, she found the journal and a single photograph of a German officer that Mason had taken from the body. But it was the inscription on the back of the photo, written in Mason's shaky, illiterate scrawl, that finally explained why he never felt he truly came home. What did he write that terrified his family enough to burn the photo? Hit subscribe and let's open the archives.